Hello and welcome to Stay for Dinner, a podcast of cooking, curiosity, and conversation. If you love cooking, hate cooking, have no idea how you even feel about it because you've never tried it before, congratulations, you are in the right place. I am DC Pierson. I am a comedian. I am an comedian. I am an author, and I am an enthusiastic home cook. And my guest on the show today is Rob Kutner, longtime late night writer for Conan, writer for The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and now writer and creator of Gander, a really cool sort of comedic explainer show on Tubi. It's a really, really funny, cool, kind of, Adam Ruins Everything-esque show that tackles topics with like sketches and fun, interesting, cool, creative visualizations. I really enjoyed it. We're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about all of the cooking that Rob has done in quarantine, which is a lot. He is making ramen, it turns out, a bunch, which I'm very jealous of, and I am considering doing a long-term ramen project here on the show, because one of the things that's kept me from doing it is it's a lot of like different stuff, or there's ways to make it where you can tackle making your own noodles, you can tackle doing everything, but that might be a project for further on in autumn. Today we are keeping it simple with a little Tuscan bread and tomato soup known as Pappa al Pomodoro. I kind of thought Pappa, like usually when you see that it's potato, and maybe it even is, but in this case it's bread and tomato that forms a thick and hearty soup that sounds really good for this time of year. But as it describes in the head note of this recipe, which is from the New York Times, you can sort of do it any time of year, I guess. Like if you want to serve it more gazpacho style, like room temperature. I guess gazpacho is usually cold. If you want to do this one room temperature, you can do it. And so it has a lot of flexibility, and I appreciate that. And another thing I appreciate about it is just the simplicity, the fact that you're literally just taking stuff that you might already have around, fresh or canned tomatoes. I'm using canned tomatoes because it's getting on to be about time when tomatoes are not that exciting as a fresh ingredient. But canned tomatoes are almost always good, and I have some good San Marzano canned tomatoes, so I'm excited about using those in this application. But before we do anything else, quick check of my ingredients calls for 1 pound of stale country bread. I have a loaf of country bread that was honestly, I'll be honest, too fresh. Had to stale it up a little bit in a 200-degree oven. It's just short of toasted. It's like when you put toast in for like not long enough and it pops up and it's like a little bit dry, but it hasn't yet started browning. That's what I did to it. 2 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil, a small onion chopped. We'll be chopping that in a second. 2 to 3 garlic cloves. I'm almost doubling that. I have 5 garlic cloves. 1.5 pounds of ripe tomatoes, peeled, seeded, and chopped, or 1 28-ounce can of tomatoes with juice. Like I said, I'm going to be using the canned tomatoes. Tablespoon of tomato paste. Here it lists a pinch of sugar twice. I'm going to go ahead and bet that it's just 1 pinch of sugar. Quarter teaspoon of red pepper flake, salt, freshly ground pepper, 4 cups of water, and 2 to 3 tablespoons of fresh basil. We have some fresh basil that is just this side of wilted, so I'm excited to use that as well. Feeling very peasant-y because we have a lot of stuff that is simple and it's going to go into this that is, stale. I mean, in my case, I made it stale or about to not be so fresh anymore, and it is all, or canned, and it's all going to become a really great new soup. Excited about it. So first things first, it says if your bread is too hard to cut, douse it with water first. As I said, mine is not super duper stale. It's not too hard to cut, although that sounds like it would make for a great soup and bread. But again, not what I have here. Then remove the crusts and cut into cubes. So I'm going to go ahead and take my stale bread and cut it into cubes. So cutting the crusts off first. And then it doesn't really say how big the cubes should be. I cut my bread into somewhat large slices to try to dry it out. But I'm betting that smaller is better. Like kind of standard, large-ish crouton size. And the bread didn't get super dried out on the interior. We'll see how that goes. It's weird to be doing this and being like, oh no, my bread isn't stale enough. But here we are. Oops, I leapt to getting into the actual recipe itself before doing all of the stuff that we got to do that is hidden in the ingredients list, i.e. the mise en place steps. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now, starting with chopping a small onion, or in my case, half of a large onion that is covered in plastic wrap from the refrigerator. Then we are going to mince. The recipe says is 2 to 3, but in my case is going to be like 5, 6 garlic cloves. And then finally, to sliver 2 to 3 tablespoons of basil. I'm going to pick the least sad looking leaves of basil and sliver them. We're not like putting the basil leaves in whole and then like fishing them out later, which I can sometimes like to or be inclined to do in recipes like this. So I'm just cutting the basil leaves across laterally to like sliver them, and I'm trying to do it as thin as possible just because it can kind of have a somewhat unpleasant texture sometimes when it's left in fresh like this. So I'm just trying to reduce the size of said pieces. And then I'm trying not to go over it too much with the knife because I don't really need to, and then it can get kind of bruised and unpleasant if you like work it over too much. But on the plus side, it's already getting really fragrant just from going it over with the knife once. Cool, that looks like about 2 to 3 tablespoons. And I think that's more or less everything I have to do with a knife. All right, back into the recipe proper. It says to heat the oil in a large, heavy soup pot over medium-low heat. I'm using a heavy Dutch oven as opposed to a soup pot. And then going to add in the onions and then just move those around until they get soft. Says about 5 minutes, which reflects my experience. So I'm going to try to keep those moving around the pan as much as possible and try to set myself up for the next step, or in 2 steps, which will be adding the tomatoes, tomato paste, sugar, red pepper flakes, and salt and pepper. So sometimes I like to kind of assemble everything if it's all getting dumped in at once like that in advance so I can just tip it in. So I'm going to put all that stuff, with the exception of the tomatoes because they're already in their own can, in like a bowl. It doesn't really give amounts for the salt and pepper that we're going to put in. So I'm just kind of eyeballing it and knowing, especially with salt, that we can always go conservative up top and add more later. And onions are looking good. Open my can of tomatoes. All right, yeah, we're in business with these onions. So next up, going to add the garlic and do what we almost always do with garlic, which is stir it around for like 30 seconds a minute until fragrant. Smelling really good. Now to add tomatoes. The tomato paste, sugar, red pepper flake, which I forgot to mention it said was optional, but is really not optional as far as I'm concerned. Salt, pepper, just tipped all that in. And cook, stirring occasionally until the tomatoes have cooked down. Gonna watch them, let them cook for about 10 minutes, cook that canned taste off and let them cook down a little bit. I would also anticipate probably seeing a somewhat darker color after cooking for a while. And you know what I guess I would have liked to do, but it's too late now? I would have added the tomato paste first and kind of cooked that in a little bit. I think it'll still be fine, but especially because mine is coming from a can, I usually like to try to hit the oil and aromatics with it and let it kind of change color. It's more just a habit than anything, I think, from a lot of different recipes where you usually see tomato paste go in. But we'll be all right. My tomatoes and everything else have been babbling away pleasantly for almost 10 minutes. Getting ready to taste this phase and adjust seasoning, knowing that, like, I guess what I'm looking for here is for this to almost seem over-seasoned at this moment, because I'm going to put in a bunch of bread and a bunch of water and some basil is the plan after this. So we're not going to get a ton of, other than I guess it also says to add a teaspoon of salt when we put the bread in. So obviously that is, an additional boost that, like any amount of these sort of oniony, garlicky, spicy flavor that we're hoping to be in there is going to be extra concentrated when I taste it here in a moment. And it is getting cooked down. A lot of the liquid is cooking off. Okay, other than me not giving it enough time to not burn my tongue, the seasoning level feels pretty good. It is a little bit spicy, which is good because ultimately, in the final analysis, I don't want the whole thing to be spicy, but since this is the kind of the most concentrated the flavors are ever going to be, the fact that it's reading spicy at this moment, I think, is ultimately good for the eventual outcome. And it is definitely, on the saltier side without being overly salted. And I'm about to add another teaspoon of salt when I put the bread and the water in. So I think ultimately that is all in balance. So I'm going to go ahead and add in the bread cubes. And 4 cups of water. And I have to say, just on a visual level, the white of the bread standing out against the red of the tomatoes, really cool looking. Well, I'm also supposed to throw in half the basil and that vaunted teaspoon of salt I keep mentioning. And stirring them around, and yeah, visually this thing looks really cool. The tomatoes are just really bright red. Watching the bread kind of get subsumed in that is neat. It's really cool. So it says bring to a simmer and simmer. Stirring and mashing the bread for about 10 minutes. So I'm turning the heat up, and it says ultimately the soup will be thick like oatmeal. But as I'm looking at it, it just looks like the visual personification of Italian food. You have the bread getting stirred in, the red, bright red of the tomatoes, the ribbons of basil. There are a few pieces in there that are a little bit bigger than I'd like them to be. What can you do? And I was a little worried about how the bread would fare, given that it was kind of soft to begin with, but it already seems to be hasn't been in there very long, and already seems to be kind of mashing in. So this is cool looking. Don't know how it will turn out, but so far, just in terms of pleasing things to see and do, for this recipe, it rates pretty highly. And I have to say, this recipe has kind of bubbled up into my consciousness, or not even just literally this recipe, but this dish has bubbled up into my consciousness in a few different forms recently. It's one of those, it's like, what is it called? The Beider-Meinhof effect, where you see something one place and then suddenly it seems like it's everywhere. It's kind of had that for me. One of them was, there was a guy on Twitter who I kind of unfairly gave some shit about calling sketches skits, which is a thing that I used to super duper care about, don't really actually care about much anymore, but I was just kind of joking about, like, you would have thought with everything else going on that I still wouldn't be able to conjure any amount of nerdy indignation for being like, they're called sketches, but I did sort of kind of unfairly quote tweeted him, as you'll sometimes do on Twitter, and then just ended up having a really nice conversation with him where he was saying, I think skits might be more of a British thing, Anyway, it was very interesting, and then somehow, I can't remember if it was in the course of that conversation or if it was just somewhere else on his Twitter feed, he ended up mentioning this dish and that he really likes it, and that was one of the ways that it kind of, I was like, oh, I gotta make that. So it was maybe the most productive being petty towards someone on Twitter has ever been. His name is Tom Gara, Gara. I should have him on the show sometime. Seems like a neat guy. So thanks, Tom. Thank you for not immediately nuking me from space for being a little bit of a jerk on Twitter just because I was bored. Oh yeah, and this, while I'm yakking here, stirring the bread around, I'm not having to actively mash a ton. It really is just kind of, it's getting in there of its own accord. I'm going to turn the simmer down. And this is giving me a little bit of the mom and Charlie in the Chocolate Factory. Have we ever talked about her? I'll bet you we have. I bring her up a lot. Where she's stirring the laundry and singing Cheer Up Charlie in what was inarguably the most... If you could just go back and just have your childhood be watching the Cheer Up Charlie portion of the original Charlie in the Chocolate Factory, you would still be young because it lasted forever. But that is how this feels right now. Feels like I'm stirring a very pleasingly colored laundry pot. And there aren't too many, but anywhere I'm seeing a larger unsubsumed chunk of bread, I am trying to kind of mash it. It's not happening very often, which is nice. All right. Oh, one thing that I'm noticing is usually, and this often will happen, I feel like, for whatever reason, the top corner of the pot will get a little warmer than everything else. I just don't know if that's like where the burner is warmest or if the stove is tilted or something, but I was noticing that up towards there, I'm really wanting to scrape the bottom of the pan because, as I feel like will sometimes happen when you have some sort of flour or other glutinous product that you're working in, sometimes can stick and maybe even run the risk of burning a little bit. So there's just a little bit of stuff gathering up at the top that I'm wanting to make sure to kind of like scrape off the top of the pan and make sure that it gets incorporated. The texture is getting pretty uniform. I'm not really seeing a whole lot of unbroken up chunks. It says that I'm trying to go for an oatmeal-like texture, so I'm bearing that in mind. I think we're approaching oatmealville, so I'm going to stir in the last of the basil, taste for seasoning, and we should be good. Yum. Ooh, yeah, it has a really nice texture. It's like a soup that's a velvety pizza sauce. If that sounds like, but like really on the thicker side. There's a nice, velvety is the word I keep coming back to. Really like that texture. I'm maybe even gonna do a little bit more pepper, a little bit more salt, and call it good. Yeah, really like that. I'm buying the hype on this peasant soup. And that is it. Please, at this time, enjoy this conversation with Rob Kutner. I really enjoyed this conversation with Rob Kutner. I think we both have the same feeling of people who were big into home cooking before the quarantine, and then now it has activated another part of that. For some people, that makes you feel more fatigued of it. Other people are finding new levels to it every day. I think I fall almost a little bit more into the former camp, and Rob falls a little bit more into the latter. It was a really fun discussion. I think you'll enjoy it. I know I did. Rob Kutner. Rob Kutner, thank you so much for joining me. If this were a normal episode of the show, I would be placing a plate of delicious food in front of you. However, it is of course not normal times, and so all I can do is hope that the last thing that you ate was both delicious and satisfying.
That is a lot of pressure on my palate. Can't handle it, man.
Dang, what was the last thing you ate?
if you don't mind me asking.
Oh, well, this was like leftover lunch, so I don't think that's quite fair to do. But it was a whole wheat wrap with hummus they make at home and some veggie sausage. Oh, and since you're a food nerd, I also make watermelon pickles from the rind of the watermelon. I pickle them,
Oh, yum.
and
Are you kidding me? That sounds like a great lunch. That sounds like extremely
all right,
elevated leftover territory.
all right, I'll take it.
You're talking about homemade hummus, you got homemade watermelon rind pickles. It feels like the last dregs of summer.
A little
That's
bit,
awesome.
yeah. Trying to hold on to the fading time.
Exactly. Are you on the East Coast
I'm in
or
I'm in LA on the West
okay,
Coast,
gotcha. Cool, cool, cool. Well there you
so
go.
it's
Yeah,
it's
but
still summer
so,
heat here. Sometimes it's a little confusing. Plus, the
and
planet's on fire.
summer just like apocalyptic layers of
Exactly.
smoke. Oh, totally. Yeah, which I guess you could reinterpret as like a sort of autumnal duskiness when it's like 1 p.m. and the sun, you look at the ground and you're like, what is it? Dusk? Because everywhere it's just like red.
Yeah, when people talk about like a smoky like whiskey or something like that, you're like, well, everything's smoky here. So
How do you even tell the difference? Yeah, it's really that's one of my big climate change concerns is the effect that it's going to have on the whiskey flight industry
yeah,
is a huge concern I have.
the actual flight industry and the whiskey flight industry are now both
Yes,
in
exactly. I
jeopardy.
think they both need a bailout, dual bailout for those
Exactly,
for those folks.
especially for all those heavy drinking pilots. Those
Oh
are
yeah, no,
It's a double
absolutely.
whammy.
But you alluded to when we were discussing you coming on the show, you alluded to being a pretty big time home cook. I would love to know first off, where does home cooking fit in or not fit into your life at the moment?
Well, first of all, since March, everybody's a big time home cook. So, uh, but I was into it before it was cool. But we eat. I have two kids, and we eat home cooked things like probably most of the time, and we probably would do takeout or something. Probably takeout at most once a week, or we use the occasional packaged things. But I've always just enjoyed it, and I usually cook the dinner. My wife does sometimes, and I think we have taken these past few months to sort of experiment and push the boundaries a little bit more and try new things. Just because we were doing it all the time now, it just became like you gotta mix it up a little bit.
Yeah, that makes sense. It kind of feels like the crossroads that you come to during this period of, like you said, like a lot of people, even if they weren't cooking at home before, suddenly finding themselves cooking from home. And it sort of seems like the crossroads that you get to is like switch up or give up. And
Right.
and I think we each probably, and that's not to say that like once you come to that crossroads and that you pick one that you can't, that you're not going to come to that crossroads again a few weeks later and make a different choice. I feel like my wife and I have taken both of those roads at various points throughout the continued quarantine.
Well, like it's also extra. I don't know if you have kids or not, but like kids are often like more like they want like sort of like plainer things, more like carb heavy things. They're not really as of interest. You kind of sometimes I'm cooking like four meals. It's like a
Oh
short order thing.
wow! Like just for dinner, you're making like four different
It's not like
things.
cooking from scratch for things. It's just, but he is like four different kinds of things that are going. Like we literally have like different. We had different tastes in pizza. So like we do our own dough sometimes, and sometimes we do the Trader Joe's blobs. Like the blobs of dough that you spread out. But
Sure.
but I had one that was like my daughter wants like only a certain sauce, and then my son wants like a molecule of sauce, and she's like spread out to like a micrometer thin. And then my wife and I like a pesto pizza or something different. So it looked like this pizza looked like Berlin after 1946. It was like four quadrants, lots of
But
airlifts brought
look,
in by the
Rob, the
Allies. I don't know.
Russians the Russians did their part to liberate that pizza. Okay, so you got to give it to them.
That's true. That's true. And there were like pieces of bricks everywhere after 1989. So
David Hasselhoff is just dancing. A tiny David Hasselhoff is strutting around your
right in the middle
pizza.
of
Like,
it. Right.
look, they love him over here. I don't know what to tell you, man.
I feel like he would just show up at some family's pizza night, like, "Hey guys, what are we having?" Like he has just like no boundaries.
That feels like a burnt out ad executives pitch for like just I think
Super
just
Bowl,
now
Super
they're
Bowl
just sort
ad,
of
right?
like fill in the blanks. 80s celebrity who's clearly had a ton of work done is just in somebody's house and they're like, and then at the end somebody just mutters Geico.
Exactly. We don't even try to have a message
Geico,
anymore.
I don't know. We've stopped even trying to justify why this is. It's David Hasselhoff.
Right.
He's in your house. It's pizza night.
Here's
Geico.
here's the thing, you know, Geico.
Yes, exactly. Much like Geico, where you're just about it. We just have to keep coming up with new excuses to
Say the word,
make you pay a little bit of attention, so that we can just begrudgingly mutter, Geico, insurance. Come on, just get
I
it.
feel like they were the only people who successfully did that. Like they did that, and they did a pretty great job. And like they sort of put themselves on the map. I mean, I hadn't heard of Geico before, and now they're sort of. And then Affleck kind of came along with the duck, and Flo was kind of like warmed over thirds. You know, I think other people tried to do it, but and now that other companies try to do this kind of stunts, it doesn't really land. It's like they sort of mastered that game. We could talk ad theory all day, though. You and me.
We could, and we will. I feel like the one that none of us ever saw coming was the General, where you just sort of like you count out the General, and then you're sort of like, oh, what are these like cheapo local feeling commercials? Is the General auto insurance? Is that just like something that only exists in like my town? Like, and somebody scraped it together to have their nephew who took a like night course on CGI and has After Effects like slap this General together in an afternoon, and then suddenly you're like, wait, Shaq is in this commercial?
That's hilarious. Yeah, kind of cognitive dissonance or something like that. It totally plays with your mind.
And also I feel like the General was able to climb back on the air sooner than any other insurance company after like in a pandemic era production model, because they were just like, look, we only have to have one human on screen maximum and it's Shaquille O'Neal, who like hovers many, meters above where the virus can penetrate, we're theorizing.
Literally,
and then
the
we just have
aerosols literally
CGI
can't reach.
General.
They literally can't reach the Shaq height. I never thought about that.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. That's my working theory. Nobody wants to
Right.
listen to it.
Well,
But how old are your kids, and how have you like watched their tastes evolve over the years?
well, okay. So I have a 12-year-old girl and an 8-year-old boy, and yeah, I mean, I've gone through. There's some prototypical stages, like some funny things that my daughter was like, I think 4 or 5 when Frozen came out. So she was like insane, coked up insane about that Frozen and everything else like that and everything. And then suddenly, like after about 2 years, it suddenly became the uncoolest thing ever for girls, because it's like that's what babies like. So it's like, don't even play that song around me. Like she was so uncool that she like when Frozen 2 came out, like I guess last year, she was like, I'm not going to go see it. Like we had free tickets to see it, and she was like, I'm not going to go see it. And then it turns out people in her class did it because they sort of mellowed. She's like, oh, why didn't you take me to see that? No, I don't.
Oh, no.
And now she's
That's
all
so
about
interesting. Do you feel like the other kids in her class had almost a sort of like, whoa, this takes me back to when I was a kid attitude about it?
Probably, yeah. There's probably like that sort of like
Wow.
nostalgia thing hits probably even earlier now,
Sure.
in faster and faster increments. And then she went through sort of like the YouTube influencer phase, and then watched all of Friends before it left Netflix, and now she's at like TikTok hardcore.
Oh, interesting. So her pop culture evolution has gone from like, okay, contemporary movie that was targeted to her, to then like, okay, this sort of like user generated media that's also probably targeted to her, to a 90s, like just a thing that could not have even conceived of her ever existing or watching it, like a thing that was made to be like, this is like by 20s and 30 somethings in the 90s, for 20s and 30 somethings in the 90s. And then she just stumbles upon it like this artifact buried in the sand or on Netflix. And then hardcore pivot back to TikTok, the most contemporary possible thing.
I never thought of that, but I'm getting a little seasick following all those undulations. I need some Dramamine to follow that.
It kind of makes sense. So, I mean, like I remember, in being a like preteen and teen in the 90s and like watching a decent amount of Nick at Night, a thing I had really no frame of reference for like any of those shows. Like my dad really liked the Andy Griffith Show, but I do remember watching that stuff, and just there was something about it that was comforting because it felt so incredibly old, I guess. And I imagine that kids her age may be having the same response to
Probably. And also,
Friends.
I should have mentioned there was also a Full House period, which did not, she I don't think she went all the way through. Oh no, she went through Fuller House as well, which is also like sort of like the other 90s, I think, touchstone, and also has a very throwback quality. I think it's a different kind of show, but like definitely feels from like a different time period. But
Do you feel like she watched them and was like, I understand my dad better. I know what his life was like before I was around. It was like Friends and
that's
Full
never the
House.
goal. There's never never desire to understand the enemy. But it is like what was good about it was like before that she had hit like just starting to hit tweendom, and like you know, here in LA we have like what is it, Kiss FM, and like all the like the top 40 stations.
Mm-hmm.
So she and her classmates suddenly discovered all that stuff, and you know, with Spotify you can kind of listen to all that stuff for free. So like they were super into, it was like a year with like nothing but Ariana Grande, and it was like all that stuff. And anytime I drove them in the car, it was like nothing but like that. And then suddenly I was like, oh my god, she's going to be in this like this era, and I'm going to be like the old man was like, you call that music? You know, I was just dreading. I could just see the whole teenagerdom playing out, and then suddenly she starts watching Full House, and this kind of continued with TikTok too. And like Full House, like they actually played a lot of music from like the 80s and stuff like that. Like they had a band and stuff like that. And she's like suddenly into all this music, and then TikTok like accelerated that because they draw in music from every era. Like it's so like her musical taste like exploded, and at one point she started saying like, you know what, the music from the last 10 years sucks. The music was so much better in the 80s and 90s. And I was like, yes, something broke through.
That is interesting. Did you have a comparable phase as a like preteen or teen? Or were you just like super steeped in you know it's interesting it's just interesting to think about, to go like, is that a function of how we consume, or kids consume media now? Or do you think it's like just every era is going to have that period of being like my wife talks about being in middle school and just suddenly like a ton of kids being into Led Zeppelin and being like, I need to, just her taking on this weird like autodidactic thing of like, I need to educate myself about Led Zeppelin or else I won't be able to like hang with my middle school peers.
It's so funny because that's exactly where I was going. I was like, yeah, I had a period of, I mean, I did, you know, I came of age in the late 80s. So, you know, that was kind of like, that was the thing in MTV, like what was on MTV, like remember back in this time when they played music briefly, like everyone was into the music, and it was kind of like all over the place what the 80s music was like. So there was different styles and stuff. I feel like that. So I wasn't, and then like, yeah, just as like I was like hitting the peak of that, suddenly like someone actually got me into Rush, and then it was like down this like rabbit hole of prog rock, yes, and Led Zeppelin and King Crimson, all this stuff like that. So it was kind of like, in a way, it was like I was like reaching back like 20 years to, you know, the stuff that had. I mean, not Rush doesn't reach back 20 years, but you know, like the stuff that kind of like had its tail end in the 70s, like definitely like pulling back from a different era and entirely style of music. And I was not at all interested in like contemporary music. So it suddenly did sort of switch, I think, at some point, just maybe a little bit later for me. I was a late bloomer in every way possible.
It is neat though to think about, just like you can sort of, I don't know, the idea of it is weirdly heartening to me to hear about kids kind of discovering, even though it's like I'm, you know, obviously biased towards like music from like the 90s and 2000s, because that was when I was a preteen and teen and college age kid, and at like music having its most central role in my life that it will ever have, where it just feel like every song that you listen to is just going directly onto your brain and into your heart, like never to be and you'll never be able to be objective about it again fully. But it's neat to think about kids still being able to sort of like find music from a different time, put it in its own context as being music from that time, and not just these sort of like free floating background noise on TikTok, and then going like, I like that. That's cool. Even if she might feel totally differently again in 2 years, is like, it's weirdly heartening.
It's great
to me.
because I lost hope, because like there was a period when she was really, even when kids are young and malleable, I would play her like all this classic rock and stuff like that in the car. And it's like, listen to that guitar. You hear those licks? That's what I was like, the lamest dad ever. But she didn't care because she's a kid. And then she like suddenly starts developing her own taste, and she only wants to listen, like I said, the pop music, doesn't want to listen to that, doesn't anything. And now she's suddenly like, you know, I turn on like whatever the local classic station is, and they start playing like Billy Idol or something like that. And she's like singing along with it. She's like, "What's this song called again?" And then "Separate Ways" by Journey comes on. She's like, "Oh yeah, I want this on my track at my bat mitzvah." So it's like I didn't have to do any work at all, and like she's like completely into it, and like we can, listen to the same things together.
Oh man, that rules. Also, that just imagining like that a song like "Separate Ways" by Journey that I feel like is probably could not personify like everything that people. I love that song. I like, my friends and I got super into it in high school as a sort of like quasi ironic, but also this is the greatest song ever.
Yeah, exactly.
In that kind of way that I feel like had to drive my dad insane, because I think he was also like, I am into Journey, but that's like almost like too late in like the Journey thing for me, like that's too like, I don't know, I think it was just too like 80s out for him as somebody that had come of age in like the 70s and being super into like, rock or whatever. Just the idea of like completely that, like that song has gone through so many different cycles of people like liking it and hating it. And now your daughter can have it at her bat mitzvah is, I don't know. I love that. I think that's really neat.
It is kind of like a lot of their oeuvre is kind of like sort of like powerful and also embarrassing at the same time. Like it's sort of like a song. There's songs just sort of like someone who just like throws their clothes off and just like walks into the public square, and you're kind of like, man, that's kind of amazing, and that's kind of cringy at the same time.
Yeah, my friend's mom said something at one point. Like I can't remember what the song was, but my friend was talking about like, I was in the car with my mom and it is certain, like some song came on and she started singing along with it. And I was like, really, Mom, you like, whatever song? That was clearly from when her mom was growing up, and it just didn't seem like something her mom would like. And she said that her mom was like, at a certain point, it's not whether you liked it or hated it. It's just that you were there. And that I've found myself liking songs that were around when I was a teenager that I felt at the time personified like, no way, that's for like jocks. That's the music that like the quote unquote popular kids listen to and like, and I don't like that. And now I'm just like, I like it. And I think I've always liked it, but it's definitely now just like wrapped in this haze of nostalgia for me.
It is sort of hard to separate like some songs or music. Like, I mean, that's the point. That's why it works for people, because it brings them back to a different era, but also like you can't detach it from it.
Exactly.
A certain part of your life. Like in, was it in High Fidelity? He says like, he's like, the guy is arranging the stuff in the music story. It's like autobiographically. Remember, he's like by periods in his life when he was listening to it. That's how he arranges all the records.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yes, precisely. And I do find, I was reading some article recently about like having, like basically a journalist was talking to a neurologist, I think, or, somebody who also studies like the effect of music on the brain, or maybe a music therapist. And it was basically saying like, why is my musical taste so weird during the pandemic? Why do I find myself reaching for or liking things that I don't normally? And, was using the examples of like, some people find themselves listening to like super nostalgic music from when they were in high school that they wouldn't listen to otherwise. Or some people find themselves listening to like ambient or classical or jazz stuff that they don't normally like. And the musicologist, I think, was basically just going like, you're freaked out. So you're reaching for something comforting or something that is like operating as like not literally therapy, but like a therapeutic, basically, that your brain is just reaching for like musical comfort food in this. You and
I found, I don't know if you found this, but someone else mentioned this as well, but I found myself with this one. I don't even know if it's an earworm, but like there's this one song. I think it was some 80s like new wave song. I can't remember what it is exactly, but kept coming up on my head like all the time. And maybe it was because of the repetitive nature of like our pandemic lifestyles, or we're just at home all the time doing the same stuff and not really varying our environment. But I kept having a song this one song kept getting stuck in my head like over and over again. Do you have anything like that?
Do you remember what song it was?
I can't remember what it is. It's like something where I can sort of access it, and I can kind of sing part of it, but I can't remember what it is. So I kind of don't even want to look it up because I want it to just go away. But it's weird.
There's no way you could be convinced to sing it right now, could you?
No.
You wouldn't want to expose anybody else to the
I know I have to
musical contagion.
I'm on lockdown in my head.
Gotcha. Okay, we appreciate it. We appreciate you taking those precautions. I have definitely found that. I would say I would have a couple of different. I can't even remember what they were, but I would have a couple of different weird songs or things sort of looping in my head, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic when it was truly like the world is completely upside down. I have no idea what is happening. And my actual like conscious musical memory of that period, like the couple weeks before like full on lockdown in like late February, early March, was I was listening a lot to the album A Kiss from the Dream House by Susie and the Banshees. And there's a song called Slow Dive that's like a really cool, creepy goth. It's like a Tim Burton dance song, basically. And it is just about basically like collapse, but it's like a do the, you know, kind of like a do the twist kind of song, but it's about like do the slow dive. And I just remember I was working a job at the time that required me to have a really long commute. And I just remember like driving to that job every day and listening to that song a lot and just being like, everything, it feels like society just has a thin veneer over it right now, and underneath is a roiling chaos. And boy, was I right. That will always be my association, was just that moment of being like, is this going to be like the last time I ever drive to work? And little did I know, I was maybe right.
Wow, that's so weird. It was like a portent of the future. Like it was like a song sent to you from the future.
A little bit, yeah. It was weird how it sort of synced up in that way. But to a cheerier pandemic subject, you were describing that you and your wife have been kind of like trying to switch up the playbook a little bit. What forms has that taken? Have there been like phases over this period of time, or have there been stuff recently that you guys have been doing that you've been excited about in the kitchen?
Well, okay, so I think I mentioned this when we were talking about this, is my kids have gotten like super into ramen, and mostly we make the stuff, you know, the stuff from the packets that you do when you're in college or beyond, or maybe still, no judgment, but just a little package kind. But then for Father's Day, my daughter got me a Chinese pasta maker. Like
Whoa.
Not even the machine, but the kind that you screw, like with the, I don't know if you know, like you screw it in. It's like a little metal cylinder, and you put the dough in one end, and then it's sort of like one of those Play-Doh things you have when you're a kid. It squirts the noodles out the other end, and you choose what shape they come out in, and you just twist this screwy end until it like pushes the pressure until they forces them out the end. And so we were like, why, I found this recipe. I was like, why don't we make ramen like completely from scratch? Like the easiest thing to make possibly. Let's make it as hard as possible.
That's super cool. Sorry, so you were saying?
So we don't do pork in our house. So we don't do the whole thing with like the pork bones where you boil them for like 48 hours or whatever like that. I think they call it the tonkatsu or something like that. But there's this vegan recipe where it's kind of a similar idea where you like, and in fact, I have one boiling right now where you like cook the garlic and the ginger and the onions. You brown it and you like cook it with the sauce, but like you cook it like on low for like an hour to 3 hours. So it like really deepens and browns and does all that stuff and gets really rich. So, but then the funny part was the noodles. So I always thought noodles were basically like some kind of combination of flour and water and maybe egg, and that's it. So with ramen, so you know how the noodles are like very springy, you know, like you pull them and they kind of spring together and that sort of thing. So it turns out there's a whole chemistry to that I found out, where first of all, you have to take baking soda and you have to bake it in the oven for like, I think a half an hour until it takes on some other chemical form. And that's actually somehow the element that gives them the spring. And then you mix that into it, but then it makes the dough like super tough because it's like, you know, it's kind of like almost rubber ball-like, I guess, which is why it's so springy. So I did all that stuff because I'm a madman and because we had plenty of time on our hands.
Sure.
But it was so tough that it actually broke the pasta machine, or it sort of like got the screw end kind of like wedged in the wrong place where it was unusable. And I had to go over to like my my tool handy friend's house and like use an industrial pipe tool to like dislodge it. And next time I was like, you know what, we're just going to do flour and water. I think that's those are still noodles. That's fine.
Oh wow! So that's like I read a there was a really cool artist who did my podcast art is a cartoonist named Sarah Beacon, and she does a lot of like food art, and she did a comic book style cookbook about ramen with this other guy, Hugh Amano. And I have dipped into it a little bit, and it's really, really neat. I've done some of the easier recipes that you can do. Like I still haven't really made my own broth. I still haven't really made my own noodles. I've just basically made like a few of the things that you can do because you're like, this is exciting, but I also want to make something like right now that doesn't take 2 days. And I'm looking forward to getting more into it this winter, but I read through it, and yeah, the noodle making process, there's like, it's like something to do with like alkali. It really went over my head.
Yeah, it was crazy. I don't know why I did it, because I think it's like once I got into it, I was like, well, I guess I have all this stuff at home. I have baking soda and I have all day. I might as well just like do this and see where it goes. But I think that's the attitude that I think that the pandemic thing has sort of like, I don't think in another part of the timeline I would be like that. I'd be like, you know what? I'll just take the easier way. Even if it's just making regular noodles, I would just do that. This is like, I feel like this is this period where you're like, it's the sort of why the fuck not time.
Yes, right, exactly. And it's cool. I mean, like what you're describing, it feels like not only just why the fuck not, and we have all this time, but it's something that you guys can all be involved in. Sounds like.
Yeah.
Is that part of it? Do your kids like to help out? Are they into that?
They were into it, and because I mean, at some point, like the thing is too hard to turn, the screw thing, but the kids were into like turning the noodle thing and helping out with that, and then my daughter's really into baking. Actually, that's been a good sort of like morale booster during this time. We had a week that was mug cake week. You know, mud cakes like those.
This is an easy phrase to say.
Yeah.
Oh, like when you pour the ingredients into like a mug and like microwave it, right?
Yeah, it's like, I don't know, it's like a half a cup of flour and then an egg or an oil and then sugar, chocolate, something like that. There's like 800,000 recipes of these online. So she found like seven different recipes, and we did a different one each day. And then it was like, and then she and my wife and my son, she and my son and I would have one, and my wife was like, you know what, I'm good, because she's like actually more careful about her health than the three of us are. But we'd have like mug cake at like 5 o'clock or something like that.
I like the idea of a family-friendly cocktail hour just being like 5 p.m.
Yes,
all right.
That's a perfect way to look at it. That was our. I do feel, because I feel bad for kids, because it's like during this period you've probably seen online, like every one of your friends, everyone's like, well, it's booze o'clock, right? So it's like we're all medicating ourselves with wine or whatever like that, and kids don't really like that stuff, or not legally allowed to have it, and would not be good for them if they did. So it's like, I have sort of probably amped up the sweets level, I think, as many people have, just to have comforting things around, but they don't really have that kind of escape. So that's really funny that like this is their equivalent to it. But I get to have both, okay? Traveler in both realms.
Please re-edit all 6 or however many seasons of Mad Men to whenever they go to like make a cocktail, it's just a mug cake.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Sally Draper brings him a mug cake. Is it funny that you bring up Mad Men? Because you remember how we know each other?
Yes, that's right. Are we talking about Meshuggah Men?
We are. You knew it was going to go there.
Best. So for those of you not familiar with, and it was it like promoting a 92nd Street Y event? What was the impetus for the comedic short Meshuggah Men?
It's a little historical background.
Please.
The Jewish holiday of Purim is sort of like the Jewish Mardi Gras in the sense that you dress up in costumes, and actually, believe it or not, it is actually literally a rabbinic commandment to drink a lot of booze during it. I'm not kidding. And there's a whole, as usual with most Jewish holidays, there's a whole story about the Jews almost being completely wiped out and then being saved at the last minute. And you tell the tradition is you tell or stage a funny version of that story. Like kind of it's a little commedia dell'arte. Like it's very like lampoony and broad. Like you're sort of like, everybody literally boos the villain and cheers for the hero. So we did kind of a modern version of that in 92nd Street. Why I gathered a bunch of professional actors and writers, and we did sort of sketches that were kind of told the story of it through like parodies of TV shows. And then to promote it, we would do like a spoof video that with the hopes of going viral. And so this was one where it was when Mad Men was on, and it was Meshuggah. It was Yiddish for crazy, and it was just this like a trailer for a bunch of clips from Mad Men, just through a very like stereotyped Jewish lens. And I think, weren't you the Pete Campbell character, as I recall?
I was the fresh-faced Pete Campbell stand-in. Yeah, it was a long
right.
It was a long
and
time
we had,
ago.
And Ellie Kemper was in it as well before she was famous.
You could also convince me that Rich Sommer of Mad Men was just straight up in it, because he was also in the same world. Like he was from the
comedy.
UCB world.
From the comedy world?
Yeah, he was a like UCB guy who was just like on a Herald team, super nice, cool guy who everybody liked. And it was really funny where he was just like, I remember there was a like internal UCB message board now that if that kind of thing was still around would just be like it would just be like, it could not exist. Like there's no way that if people were like, yeah, there's just like 80 people at UCB that have a message board that nobody else can read. Like it would just be burnt. The internet would be burned to the ground. But that said, I feel like it was fairly, as I recall anyway, like fairly just innocent people just like doing bits and stuff. But I remember at one point he posted on the like internal UCB message board, like, hey guys, you probably won't see me around for a while. I'm just going to LA to like shoot this thing. It should be pretty cool. Like we'll see what happens with it. Offered zero details. And then like 6 months later posted probably to that same thread on the message board, just like, hey guys, here's a link to this like trailer for this thing. Should be pretty cool. It's like what I was out in LA doing. And it was just Mad Men. And
that's crazy.
It was so
cool.
I'm
a little bit mad. I'm a little bit mad to hear that, because now I realize I didn't actually know that. I knew he had done a lot of comedy stuff since. I didn't actually realize he was already in that world before that. So he was actually probably, in theory, gettable, although he was probably shooting in LA, actually, to be honest.
I would imagine so, but I mean, there's no reason that you can't like bank a 15-year or whatever Meshuggah Men special edition featuring Rich.
There we go, reunion tour. So we didn't know. Exactly. So I didn't know about that. That would have been great. But the previous year, the one we'd done that sort of really put us on the map was we did a parody of that at the time iconic trailer for Juno, but it was JEWNO. And we actually got through a bunch of connections. We actually got J.K. Simmons to play the father in that.
Oh,
just like rules. He did in the movie, which was insane. But when he did it with this sort of like Jackie Mason like Borscht Belt accent, which was hilarious for him. Imagine him doing that. The guy who was most famous at that point, I think even before J. Jonah Jameson, or maybe at the same time, his most famous role was like the neo-Nazi leader on Oz. So then he's doing like a complete creative 180.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Wow. That is, what a get. That rules. Yeah. That was a hoot also, just to like get to be in I was such a big Mad Men fan at the time, and it was like fresh out, and just to like get to play in that world a little bit was super fun. And I remember also my one line being, I don't remember the entire line. I might be dropping a specific here, but it was something to the effect of like, come on, Don, you couldn't use that, whatever it was, to spackle a mikveh. And I had to learn what a mikveh is.
Yeah, right, exactly. I don't know what that was either, but I think you got it right. Anytime you have like that many K's at the end of a word,
it's just funny. It's just funny.
It's just math, really. It's just comedy math.
Exactly. Yeah, no, that was, oh man, what a fun time when people were still figuring out like, oh shit, you can make like videos. And then we're going to like, the main thing isn't even putting them online. The main thing is like showing them to people in live settings, like showing them 5-minute internet videos.
Yeah, screenings for videos. Right, exactly. There was this time when like suddenly the technology was mature and everybody could just make a video if they knew enough people and they could figure it out, like in New York or LA or any kind of creative town. And then there was a period when you could get paid for doing that. And now we're back at the first period where Funny or Die and all those places aren't really like doing that anymore for, I think funding those things as well, because they sort of have gone under. But yes, it was kind of like the dawning of that like DIY, I think, comedy video thing. And we were excited because our big get at the time was the guy who played the Don Draper character had been like, there was a big spoof on, I think it was College Humor or UCB or Funny or Die. One of the big promoters had their own Mad Men parody that was big, and he was the guy who played it, and then we got him for this one, and we were like, we got the Don Draper from the other parody to this one, so it's like double parody magic, man.
Just a parody nesting doll.
Exactly.
Did you find, so you were a late night writer for a number of years. I mean, like, did you find that schedule, have you always been big into cooking, and did that affect your schedule, or is that something that you've come to no longer having that schedule, or was there even a regularity to it where you found that like you could fit it in? Like, how did that affect that part of your life?
Actually, so it really, every show has its different pace of work, but the Daily Show with Jon Stewart, which is what I was on then, was really well organized, and they taped at I think 5:30 or something like that every day. And not only that, but they really sort of had worked out all the day's work by that point. So you could pretty much go home at 5:36, which just sounds insane if you think about a lot of TV schedules. It's more often, I think, sitcoms that have the crazy hours, sometimes into the wee hours. And even, and then the Conan show, the late night show, which I later wrote for when it was in LA, but in New York, they would stay until 10 or 11 sometimes, famously. So it was kind of an outlier in that sense. And so I would pretty much come home for dinner time, and we didn't have kids at the time. So I think we still enjoyed it, even though there was a little bit more, obviously lots of restaurants to go to in New York. My wife and I just sort of moved there. We got into the kind of dinner party, or the sort of hosting people scenes. That was a fun thing for us. But then I think at that point we kind of got our brunch game on more.
Oh, because, interesting. Making brunch at home?
Brunch is just the easier thing. Well, first of all, you can go out and get amazing bagels that are fresh. And then you can make a frittata or a quiche or something like that. And a little salad, and then people are just think that's put some mimosas out, and people think it's the greatest thing ever. It's so funny, so many people in New York have these I read about they have the Viking stoves, or they have these fancy setups, and they use them to heat up their takeout containers.
Yes, we have. It has been a recent topic on the show, even the sort of the tragedy of the underutilized amazing rich people stove.
Yeah, exactly. Truly the greatest tragedy of our times.
Oh, absolutely. By far.
The greatest victim.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there was this whole class of, we had a bunch of friends and stuff, and they were they thought it was amazing that we would throw a brunch and have them over, when I just described some of probably the if not the easiest, and at least the sort of most foolproof things you can make. Those are dishes that you put eggs and some stuff together in it and bake it, and it's pretty hard to mess up. But everyone thinks it's so amazing that you do it. So, and also it's just Sunday is easier. It's hard to have an old fashioned dinner party because people work. I think nowadays people work later hours than they used to, honestly. Just as sort of the culture. So you don't know when people are available, or if they don't want to stay late. So it's just Sunday's perfect because people can just come over and just get a little buzzed, and they don't really have anywhere to go. And so that was a nice thing that we were kind of into for a while.
Yeah, we've never really done it, but Haley, my wife, and I have often. We really, really like giving dinner parties, and we feel like that would be, or at least we used to say that would be the next level, or the level up from what we were doing. Now, having any dinner parties at all, or having people over would be the level up from where we're at right now, obviously. But yeah, we do. I remember I got super into the Robert A. Caro, Lyndon B. Johnson biographies. That was a big kick I went on. And that was before quarantine. I could have been anywhere doing anything. And instead I was listening to those on audiobook, which I do recommend. But they talked about how they would use hospitality to kind of cultivate people, and Lady Bird Johnson would kind of use that, and they would just, as they described it, just have people over to read the paper on Sunday morning. They would just be oh, come over and read the paper and we'll have breakfast. And just the idea that you would have other adults over to your house before noon, especially for a non-sports reason, is so incredibly grown up that I love it. I'm jealous of it. And as soon as it is safe to do, we got to get that. We got to get that started again. That sounds incredible to me. But yeah, I think there's something. I'm just impressed hearing about you guys doing it. But I do think there's something about the idea of okay, we're over at your house before noon, so the presumption is that because you made this food, you were probably up even earlier than us. So wow, get a load of us, aren't we grown up?
Aren't we fancy? I love that. This is now, you've now further complicated LBJ's legacy for me. So it's like he got civil rights done when Kennedy couldn't. He got us into Vietnam when he shouldn't have. But then he also made the dinner party a thing too. So really, I mean, this guy is just a bundle of contradictions.
I know, and he had a famous ribs recipe.
Wow, okay.
That I always mean to make, but I never have. That he would make.
That's
LBJ
That's so
ribs.
Funny from his Texas heritage. That's
great.
Big
time.
We were definitely trying to cultivate our court of political influence for sure. That was definitely
absolutely. I see where you guys are coming from. I respect it. I have nothing but respect for that.
In a way, it was kind of like a good way to like just see a bunch of people at one time.
Yeah,
like,
that makes sense.
It was funny, like, because we moved to New York from LA, and there was like we both were from the East Coast, went to school in the East Coast, and we knew a lot of people in New York, but it's like it's hard to kind of like pin people down sometimes, I think, or you end up going, we weren't the people who went out to restaurants all the time because we did sort of cook for ourselves at home. So if you're not that kind of person, you're not going to see people as often. So you can see like, you can have 10 or 15 people over. That's a whole bunch of social networking you can do all at once in a very like, pretty casual setting. So it makes a lot of sense practically as well.
Yeah, it's such a neat idea, and it's so cool. And yeah, it just does feel very like grown up to me. And it just is like exactly what you said. It's sort of like we really like throwing dinner parties, but we often don't think about doing it or, we should have those people over. It's either like we're going to ask somebody like a week in advance and then it's too soon, or we're going to ask them a month and a half in advance and then it's way too far in the future. Like we never quite.
That's the whole brunch thing, is that nobody has plans on the first part of Sunday.
Exactly, Rob. Oh, it's genius. Yeah.
That's
like,
that's
what
their
are you
weak
doing?
spot. The weak spot in their calendar. The soft underbelly, literally.
Oh, yes. That is perfect. They have to come over.
Right, they have no excuse unless they're churchgoers, in which case we're probably not friends with them.
I think the only time we've done something remotely like that is Haley's family has a like famous bread pudding recipe that they always do like on Christmas, I think. And she got the recipe and made it because her brother was in town and she wasn't going to get to see him otherwise. So it was kind of what you're describing. Where it was like, okay, you're going to leave at like noon on Sunday, so come over like early. And she got up like way earlier even and made it. And then he like came over at like 8 or 9 on his way to the airport and like came over, had the bread pudding, and then the bread pudding was so good. And also he just happened to be, I think, like in the same neighborhood that like a friend of her brother's ended up showing up kind of unannounced. So we were just like, who's this guy? And he was like, oh, this is my friend. He lives like down the street from you. And he was like, yeah, I'm like taking a break from band practice or whatever. So brunch was so good and so appealing that a random guy showed up. So that is a testament to the power of that home brunch.
I feel like that's a thing that at least if it doesn't exist now, has existed in some other cultures that have like, it's like, like making a paella in Spain or something like that. There's some kind of big dish that you make and it's like, oh, that's the impetus for the event. Like this little excuse for the event to have the social thing around it. And that's just a normal thing. Like it's a little bit more strange it feels more artificial to us, but it's a very natural thing, I think, in certain cultures.
Oh no, I think you're totally right. And it's just, it's just a good excuse. It's like food can serve as such a good excuse to do and see, to see people. And it just makes it, you don't have to just say like, we just want to see you.
So the more contemporary version of that, to flash forward back to this time, is that this is like the most late 2020 thing you can think of, is that basically, so I should tell you, my wife has a podcast too, if I can do some cross podcast promotion.
Absolutely.
So do you know nextdoor.com? That
I do. Yes.
So it's for people who don't know, it's like a local neighborhood website that's like hyper local for wherever you live. Like you enter your zip code and then it's like, it's within like a few miles radius of you at most. So it's literally your neighborhood. So people it's supposed to be like a Craigslist thing where you can sell things, or like if there was like a loud like helicopter noise, you ask who heard about that. It's often turned into sort of a Karening profiling thing. Like I saw a suspicious looking male in my neighborhood, which means a person of color. That's the unfortunate part of it. But basically anybody who has any kind of local baggage or thing they're complaining about or something like that posts on it. And so my wife and her friends started a podcast where they do in-depth investigations of the stories like posted on our local one.
Oh,
and
wow.
it's comedic. So like they go and they like interview the real people, but then they they do experiments. They try to replicate the conditions sometimes, or they grill the main offender or that sort of thing. And there's a lot of jokes in it. So it's kind of a fun hyper local investigative stories thing. So she and her co-host, her co-host is kind of a foodie and is always interested in whatever I'm brewing up over here. So what we've been doing lately is text banking, not text banking, but postcarding, to get people in swing states to vote, or getting people who aren't registered to vote, or just to encourage people to vote wherever in other states outside of California. And since everyone knows how we in California are going to vote, at least we can have an influence somewhere else. So, but the whole to go back to the using food as a social magnet. So the whole excuse for it is that I've been trying to sort of up our cocktail game a little bit. So so one thing is I looked up, we had tomato juice left over from making gazpacho, and I don't know if you ever make it, but you have to buy gazpacho in basically huge bottles, and it's never there's always sits in your refrigerator, it's never used. So I was like screw it, let's make Bloody Marys. So and Bloody Mary has 16 ingredients, but it's kind of awesome and it's worth it. So I looked up how to make Bloody Marys, and so it was let's have Bloody Marys and do postcarding. And so we did it socially distanced, we have a small little outdoor shaded area, and so she brought her son over, and we sat 10 feet away from each other, and had cocktails at 5:00 and did postcards. And then that became a thing we did a lot. And another one of these weird things that I do in the watermelon pickles is this is a cool trick you might want to try yourself. I've definitely picked up during pandemic times when I've been thinking about how to reuse stuff, or just how to I feel bad about throwing stuff out. So it's called a cordial, and basically any kind of citrus scraps you have, like peels or squeezed lemon husks, you throw them in a bowl. And I found this out from a recipe somewhere, but you throw them in a bowl, you dump about the same amount of sugar over it as the weight of the peels or whatever, so maybe a half cup or a cup, whatever, if you have a big bowl of them, and you leave it for a few hours, and the sugar pulls the citrus oils out of the peels, and it drips to the bottom, and it makes this sort of bittersweet citrus syrup. That's a great mixer. It's just a perfect mixer with gin or vodka and soda or anything like that. It's like a little bittersweet citrus soda thing. And so now I throw all of the peels into that, and I have that sitting around, a little jar of it. It looks like a urine sample sitting in my fridge. But so she'll come over and it's come over, we'll make cordials and we'll do postcarding. So using food scraps to make alcohol to postcard for the election is the most peak 2020.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, absolutely.
10 feet away from each other in masks.
At a drive-in movie. We're seeing the New Mutants at the drive-in while we do
exactly.
That is really cool. I love that trick. Yeah, my main go-to lemon peel trick, or half of a squeezed out lemon trick, is just it makes the garbage disposal smell slightly less bad.
Oh yes, that's a good one too.
So I love to have a use for that, because we have found this year to be, it's been a terrible year for everything else, but a great year for citrus.
That's how the history books will remember it, I think.
Absolutely. I think it's only going to get better for citrus until the earth is a cinder. I think that's basically right. How it goes. It'll be the best grapefruit you ever had, and then the earth will just plummet into the sun.
Yes, because it's usually the cold that shuts it down, right, or something like that. So if it's warm enough, you get a longer citrus season, maybe something like that.
There you go. Yeah, no, I do think there are. I don't know really what they are, and I feel anytime I'm tempted to learn more about it, I feel it will just be depressing. But I had a guest on, Ali Bazari, who is a food scientist, and he was talking about how there will be certain advantages food. There will also be obviously terrible, terrible disadvantages and just disparities that are already in place that will get incredibly accelerated by and inequalities that will get accelerated by climate change, but that there will also be these weird kind of quirky things where stuff will start growing in places that it never did before, and it'll be oh, whoa, that's cool, but then we'll also be reaching up for said delicious sumo mandarin from an underground bunker, if we're lucky.
That is, I'm sure there's some, obviously there's some positive sides to the climate warming up in some places, but yeah, that's definitely a glass half full of cocktail. way to
Yeah,
look
like
at it.
not worth. Yes, exactly. But like not worth it. But
looking for the silver linings. The other thing is,
precisely.
and so we have this massive lemon tree. I mean, I'm in California. We have this massive lemon tree growing outside in our backyard, and there's no way you would actually use all the lemons for that stuff. But do you know about preserved lemons?
We do, yes. But you guys make them at home. I don't think my wife has made preserved Buddha's hand because we got a Buddha's hand one time and we didn't know what to do with it. Buddha's hand?
What's yeah?
It
what
is
that?
it's basically a type of citrus that is literally all rind. Like there's no fruit inside of it, like no like juicy sort of like pulpy part. It's basically just the rind, and it's called a Buddha's hand because it literally looks like a sort of gnarled yellow hand. And so she cut it up and made like a preserve out of it, and then we would use that for just various dishes where we would use like preserved lemon and different stuff. But it's got a different, it's kind of right between a lemon and a lime, and it's very it's really, really good. Like the zest of it is great. You want to be like, I would love to taste whatever the fruit of this would be like, but you can't. It's just the rind.
It's a tease. It's the tease of fruits.
Precisely.
Right.
Exactly.
So cool. So cool.
Yes, totally. So, but you guys make preserved lemon as well?
Yeah. So you just like take the you take the fruit out, or actually you don't need to take the fruit out, but you like cut up and you salt it. You put a ton of salt in it, and it has to sit around for like I think a month or something like that. Or actually I think it's like almost maybe 3 months. But then you have it forever, and it sits in this brine. And then we just like I guess you probably use it. Would you use it for savory things though? It's a salty one as well. What you do?
Definitely, yeah. There's a recipe called Canal House Chicken Thighs that I think is named after a restaurant in New York that I hope is still open. I've never actually been there. But it basically is just you cook chicken thighs skin down for a really, really, really long time. And then you throw in chopped up preserved lemon and you flip them and you stir the preserved lemon into the chicken fat. And it is sensational.
That sounds great. What we do, our most popular thing is we do everybody likes a roasted salmon in our house, or a broiled salmon. That's the one thing the four of us agree on. So it's all we have. It's all we have. Don't take it from us. So, but the kids like it like just plain. Just put it. You just marinate it in oil, put it under the broiler for a little bit. But for my wife and I, we do a crust where we like chop up the preserved lemon, like very, very mince it very fine, and then so this is my favorite part is that we have. We also have this massive rosemary bush in front, and like there's like two uses for rosemary, really. I mean, like maybe 3. So it feels like a shame there's this thing we can't really use. But anyway, so like chop up the rosemary really fine and the garlic, and I also pickle garlic. I ferment garlic a little bit, which is a thing that it just lasts longer and it's a little mellower. But it's not pickled. It just like has a more like mellow taste, and it's sort of you can keep around forever. So I chop up, but it also like it doesn't have the bite if you don't cook it enough. So chop up all 3 of those things into like sort of a fine, almost a paste, and then put it on as a crust, and then you broil it, and the whole thing it cooks all the things just enough, and it's just like a nice little thing. So that's our.
Do you put it on the skin side or the flesh side?
Well, we're pussies, so we don't have skin. We have it. We buy the pre-skinned.
Oh,
fillets.
Fantastic! Oh, I was wondering. I was hoping you would say the flesh part because that made more sense to me, and that sounds fantastic. And I agree with you. Rosemary is like such a great herb, but it weirdly is like. It's like if you had an herb like that was a kid with a lot of different allergies and stuff where it's like, or an overprotective parent where it's just like, my mom says I can't be one of the many beautiful herbs that you can just like throw on top of a dish of fried rice or something. Like it's not exactly what you said. It's not a great garnish for a lot of things. It just doesn't have it's great where it's great.
It's like anise or something like that.
Precisely.
We did make a rosemary lemonade that one time, which sounds like sounds weird, but it's actually very good. It's sort of I don't know how to explain it, but like the sort of dryness of the flavor kind of like curbs the lemoniness or something like that. It has like a good somehow it plays well together. Like it's like kind of it feels like a dry cocktail, but of a lemonade. Like it just sort of mellows it out or something. Or
Do you guys ever, it feels very, do you guys ever eat or order out from Dune?
I don't know what that is. No, is that in LA?
It's in LA. It's a like Mediterranean place. Basically how I usually refer to it is Dune is like if Mamoons in New York, like in the Village, the sort of like famous like college area like falafel stand. If Mamoons went to an Ivy League school, it would be Dune. Like it's very sort of, it's just very sort of like stepped up. And that's not to take anything away from Mamoons. I love Mamoons, but like it's very kind of just, it went through a rebrand, but everything there is actually lives up to the sort of like the kind of like shishi like wrapping of Dune. It is so good. Their pita is so good. All of their bread is so good. All of their falafel's great. Like everything there is so good. And just something about a rosemary lemonade felt very Dune to me. Like very those sort of like Mediterranean flavors.
Heightened. We had a place called Momed, which I think may have closed, but I think it was this sort of, it was like Momed is modern Mediterranean, and
we love
we used
Momed.
to live. And oh yeah, Okay, so and they had this thing called. Did you ever have muhammara or I don't know or muhammara? That was that was like a revelation. It's like was like pomegranate and walnuts and parsley or something else like that, but it's just like addictive.
Oh yeah, Momed is great. I really hope they're still open. That used to be our go-to like Friday or Saturday night like happy hour place. They had a great happy hour.
Yeah, it was
maybe
kind of a
they
scene.
still have, but we haven't really been like eating. We haven't really even outdoor. We haven't really been eating out. So I'm gonna say I hope they're still open with the guilty knowledge that we haven't really done a whole lot to make that continue to be a reality since the pandemic, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's the thing. We have to just sort of wonder and hope about our favorite places.
It stinks. It's the pits. But to pivot, watch this segue. This is going to be great. From things that are potentially ending in the pandemic, and it's sad. Let's talk about something that is starting during the pandemic, is launching during the pandemic, and is good and cool. Which is, I wanted to talk about your. Can you talk a little bit about your new show that you're putting out?
I do not come on podcast to plug, so I'm offended. But wow, that was
very
amazing.
Believable.
That was like that was an amazing. Simone Biles is like her jaw just dropped watching you make that contortion.
Oh man, I just had such a sorry, real quick. I just had such a visceral flashback to one time I have written for a lot of award shows, and one time the year after, whenever it was, I guess it was 2016, that there was like the Fab Five, or then they became the Final Five, like American gymnasts featuring Simone Biles. There was it wasn't her. It was Gabby Douglas, I believe, was one of the Final Five or whatever. And so we wrote a thing that was basically, it was like the Fab Five. We're going to be presenting the Best Female Artist Award. And there was 5 nominees who were female artists, and there were 5 female gymnasts. And so as a like cheesy award show writer, you're just like, this writes its fucking self. It's about like, it's just them, and they're just like talking about like 5 amazing women who have whatever, and it's the classic sort of like, they could also be talking about themselves, and it just like sails through. Everybody approves it, everybody loves it, and then they all like come into pre-read where they have to like read their thing on the teleprompter before they go out to present. And it's like, oh, by the way, Gabby is like not feeling well. She has like the flu or something, so she's not going to be here. So this whole thing about 5 women doesn't work, and we just had to rewrite it on the fly. And I think it was basically them going like, champions, wow. Anyway, here are the nominees.
That's amazing. That reminds me of what was it like? I don't know if it was Chuck Woolery. It was one of these other sort of mainstays of game shows, but he was on one of these. It was sort of like, I feel like it was in the early 2000s. There was this renaissance of game shows. It was when like Deal or No Deal came back, and it was like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Like there was this huge upsurge in game shows because networks remembered they were cheap, and they had one of these evening game shows, and like the the sort of meet the contestants part at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
So this woman, it shows you who's quick on their feet and who's not. The guest says, "Yes, my name is Polly Perfect," and the host just sits there and he goes, "Probably perfect. Let's start the game." It's like, you can see in some hands there would be something there to do with that, but he's like,
Precisely, and sometimes that's the best segue that there is. It's just
sometimes
sort of
you can't top the
knowing
reality.
like, there's something there. Yep, here we go.
Fill in your own joke.
It's just the acknowledgement. But yeah, so you refuse to plug this, and I
all right, fine, twist my arm.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I've been in late night for almost 20 years, as I had mentioned, and last year I actually left Conan in 2018, and I was sort of done with late night and kind of moving on to scripted things, and I've been doing stuff in animation since then. But my friend, who's a writer-director who made the Hebrew Hammer, that sort of cult classic that's always on Comedy Central with Adam Goldberg and Judy Greer. He and I are friends, and he moved to Ireland because it's much cheaper to live there than in LA. And he comes into town for gigs, and he met this Irish tech entrepreneur who's very successful and very rich and very political. And he's like, he loves the shows like John Oliver and Hassan Minhaj and Sam Bean. He's like, I want to make a show like that about some of the issues I care about, and I'll finance it. So he hired my friend to create a show, and then my friend's like a great director, producer, writer, but he hasn't really worked in late night. So he turns to me and says, "What are you working on?" I was like, "Funny you should mention that. I'm not working on anything right now." So we put our heads together and came up with a different spin on the sort of what they call fact-based comedy shows, where the issues and the stories are kind of driven by actual stories and factual research. So we took on a couple of evergreen topics, which one of them, food delivery services, is apropos here, and a bunch of stories about how essentially how corporations are sort of exploiting us, or how we've made a culture that's dysfunctional because we are kind of value the wrong things. They're all kind of evergreen social topics, but they're not tied into the news cycle. They're not based on things that happened this week that we're reacting to, like a lot of these shows are. So we actually made it last year. We filmed it last year, and it's just coming out now. And thankfully, the topics are evergreens, that they're still mostly applicable. And then instead of having a host, we wanted to just change the game up and not have one more host at a desk, so we wouldn't sort of be compared to everybody else who's doing it so well already. So we have sort of a rotating cast of hosts, different comedians like Lewis Black, and actually Adam Goldberg is in this as well, and Rachel Dratch and Maz Jobrani, and two of the kids in the hall, and Oscar Nunez, and just a bunch of great people that we always wanted to work with. Kind of take turns telling the stories that we're focusing on. And also we made it really kind of rude and kind of R-rated and kind of outrageous, because we're sort of aiming for, where a lot of these shows, like John Oliver is really for people who are kind of paying attention and are pretty plugged in and just willing to take a deeper dive, I think. This is kind of trying to reach out to making a lot of noise comedically, to try to reach out to people who aren't really paying attention to what's happening in the world, to kind of get them into the comedy of it, and then slip some facts in there and some, perspective. So, kind of inverting that formula a little bit, less facts and then comedy, and more comedy that's underlined by research, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And that totally makes sense hearing you describe it. I watched the first episode about food delivery services, and it was just it was really, really interesting, because I'm someone that has always been a little bit skeptical of those services. And so, but also just because out of a generalized technophobia that I often have of just I don't know if I want to get another app for that thing or whatever. But I felt weirdly vindicated, being oh yeah, I thought they were kind of shitty. And I've definitely seen some restaurant owners and people being oh yeah, they're shitty and exploitative. And so I definitely felt vindicated. And I also just felt oh, this is a really funny, weird, you have Lewis Black, giving part of this show's monologue, from inside of an asshole, right? He's
yes.
inside somebody's lower intestine. And first of all, I mean, great. Lewis Black, that's it. I can't, I still find myself any show that I write on, it has segments. I have to force myself not to write for a segment we call whatever, because of for a segment we call Back in Black. It's just imprinted on my brain. But
Hilarious.
yeah, it was super, super fun and imaginative. And yeah, just so many different cool, weird, imaginative, fun, irreverent elements that I was just thinking as I was watching it, like, as there was like a random kid floats across the screen and high fives this other guy. And there's all these insane, weird callbacks and things that are happening within the episode. I just thought like, this must've been so fun to write. Like it's very, exactly what you said, mission accomplished, I think in terms of, at least from the episode I saw, in terms of what you were going for. It was super, super fun.
Thank you. I mean, it really was because, we weren't like, I'm used to operating in the sort of factory floor model of late night shows, which is, they're strip shows. They're on 4 or 5 nights a week. So you have like a very structured schedule. You got to get something on the air that night. Everybody's working on something. You sort of put things together as best you can. You choose the best of what you have. If it's not good enough, you kick it, you kill it probably. And it's like costumes in the barn. You put on a show that night. And so it's a totally different model. And this was like, we didn't have any kind of, we didn't have a distributor at the time. The idea was to just make it and then try to sell it, which we ended up doing to Tubi. But we were just like, we're going to make this show and just put whatever we want into it. And we don't have to sort of like book a guest right now. And that's who we have to use them right away. Like we're going to figure out which guests we want, who's available, we can get them, then schedule something when they're available. So we shot a bunch of the people in New York. Like the director came into New York for a week. He came into LA for a week. We arranged all the bookings then so we could get exactly who we wanted when they were available. And yeah, like just doing all these crazy bits where we could sort of like, I mean, it was funny, like, working for, you would think, like you said, callbacks, like callback you think is a really common thing that comedians rely on, like a sitcom or a movie, I think specifically when it's crafted. But like on a late night show, you don't do callbacks because the first thing that was in the callback might not work or might get cut for time or might bomb with the test audience. You know what I'm saying? Like you can't really structure things that play out across an episode because it's all kind of put together in discrete pieces. Does that make sense what I'm talking about?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Like modular wise, I guess. But with this, you can sort of like, it's in the style of a late night show, a variety show, but you can kind of plan out the entire structure of it. And, we sort of took as long as we needed to put it together. So it is like an artisanally hand batch crafted version of that formula.
Well, yeah, definitely mission accomplished. I think it's a really, really neat thing. And if people want to check it out, they can find it on Tubi.
Yeah. Which I didn't even really know about actually until they told me that that's who picked it up, which is Tubi is kind of like a free Netflix. It doesn't have like all the original stuff. It has like a pretty big library, and also I think they get a lot of second run stuff. Like they show like The Masked Singer like a week or two after it airs or stuff like that. It's kind of random. I don't really understand what their sort of organizing principle is, but I think we might be the first original show that is on it. But and it's called Gander. So if you go on there, there's no categories. Like if you go on it, you can just search for it there. But I think basically anyone can get it for free. You can get it on your phone, or you can watch it on like the Tubi website, just like on your computer. You don't really have to like subscribe or anything.
It's super fun. And yeah, I appreciate, just as you were saying, the mission statement of trying to be like, this isn't for somebody who's already interested. This is meant for, I mean, it can be that if I found myself, I'm already interested in like, why are meal delivery apps bad? And I found it to be very interesting and funny and informative, but also I just appreciate, like, I always feel like, yeah, we need more stuff. Like, I feel like all the wrong people are like winning the content wars on like streaming sites where they're just like, there's this insane guy puts out a 3-hour podcast every day and people watch it because they're like, well, I just have to, like, I'm at work. I might as well, I need something. So I appreciate that you guys are trying to like fight back in the like streaming content wars and get some good stuff out there that people can consume that isn't virulently racist, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
It's like, it's adequately racist, just not
yes,
virulent.
Yes,
let's be clear.
Just enough. Final question, Rob Kutner, before we wrap up here, if there was a single thing that either something that you grew up eating that you love, or something that you and your wife maybe have like eaten in like a restaurant at some point over the years and loved, just anything at all that you don't already know how to cook. If you could snap your fingers and just know how to make it perfectly, what would it be?
Oh, okay. I've got a deep cut for you.
Please.
And that's by the way, that's deep KUT.
Ooh, okay.
It's a Moroccan dish called malawach. Have you heard of this?
I have not.
But they didn't even have it at Momed. But it's basically like, it's kind of like, it's a bunch of layers of, I think it's sort of phyllo dough. That sort of, it has that kind of feel to it, that are like round. It's like this sort of the size of like a medium pizza, and or maybe even a personal pan pizza, and it's round, and it's like a bunch of layers to it, and it's like, it's heavily fried, it's deep fried.
Ooh.
So it's sort of like crunchy and greasy and fried, and then they just like, they use it as like a palette to just sort of put, you know, like Moroccan spice ground beef on it, or like eggplants, or, you know, some sort of hummus kind of combination. There's one great one with like hummus and harissa sauce and egg, which we used to have at this restaurant. There's a restaurant called the Magic Carpet that is no longer in LA. I think it's been gone for probably 15 years. And they sell a frozen version of it at the stores, which I think is just not really the same thing. But I think it would be very hard and messy to make it yourself, and it wouldn't be, and also terrible for your heart probably. But we brought someone to this restaurant once who had never heard of it, and he like ordered one to go, like to take home.
Oh, wow.
So it was like you could go and have like two slices of it, like pizza size slices of it, and then you were so full you would just take it the rest of it home and have another meal with it later.
Oh, fantastic. It's funny how many times when I answer this question, the answer from somebody is something that involves layered dough that you would literally never want to make at home. Layered dough is such a stopper for people. And I'm with that. I mean, any kind of dough is pretty much a stopper for me. So,
no, especially the phyllo dough, because it's such a pain in the ass. Like, and you can get, it breaks, and it's, don't get me started on phyllo dough. I've said that before.
In fact, not only am I not going to get you started, but I'm going to end the podcast right here.
Man.
Before you can even try. I'm cutting your mic. Rob Kutner, thank you so much for joining me, man. This was a hoot.
This is a great pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
All right, that is it. That is all for this week's episode of Stay for Dinner. Thank you so much to my guest, Rob Kutner. Please check out his new show, Gander. It is on Tubi. That is tubitv.com, tubitv.com. Check it out. And thank you so much to Jason Anderson for providing my intro song, July 4th, 2004. Thank you to Owen Ashworth, also known as Advanced Bass, for providing my interstitial music. Thank you to Sarah Beacon, who I mentioned during the show, for my podcast art. I'm, if you can't tell, I am filled with gratitude, and I would even extend that gratitude to you if you would rate the podcast. If you haven't, wherever you get your podcasts, it really helps people find the show, and that in turn helps there be more show. I've written a couple of novels, The Boy Who Couldn't Sleep and Never Had To, and Crap Kingdom. They are available anywhere fine books are sold. You know what would be great if you would do? Find your local independent bookseller, go in or column or whatever feels safe and they are making available to you, and ask them to order my books if they don't already have them in stock, and then buy them from them. Support your local independent bookseller, especially over the holiday season. This is going to be make or break for so many amazing bookstores throughout America. Please support them. Please keep them alive. And in the meantime, I will be back next week with another episode, and I will talk to you then. Bye.